Welcome to Birds in the Sky, a podcast that focuses on the arts and music as a means to regulate our mental health. I am your host, Matthew Crane, a U.S. Navy veteran, musician, and artist. We'll be hearing from military veterans, mental health professionals, artists, musicians, and educators on their unique perspectives and how creative outlets can help move us forward. Today we have Paul Hogan, a Buffalo, New York-based poet, essayist, and former nonprofit administrator. Paul has done a number of different things. He's released a couple of books on poetry. I have two of them. He's also a Navy veteran. He served from 1972 to 1976. We have that in common. We both served in the Navy, the world's finest Navy, I should add, and stationed for much of that time in Spain. And I met you through the AmeriCorps programming a million years ago through Mark Lazara, I think. And we were
Mark Lazara.
Yeah, we were trying to grow our AmeriCorps programming and get more members in and things like that. I think it might have been 2008 era. Since then, I think our lives became a little bit more entwined. Now my kids learn Taekwondo from your son.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Very cool. So thanks for coming in.
Sure.
I really appreciate you giving your time to this. So I guess first thing I wanted to know is kind of walk me through your choice to join the Navy. Like, what was it about the Navy that brought you, and rather than the Army or the Coast Guard or something like that?
Well, it was, so I was 17, right? I was still in high school. I was looking at the draft and I had no other options. I was, a Dead Sea student, no scholarships. My parents were not going to help me. They couldn't help with college, So, and there was a family business that I really despised and did not want to inherit, or work at. So, and there was no circus in town, to join and run away with. But Navy, selfishly, it was like, if I join the Navy, I won't have to go to Vietnam. You know what I mean? Which was just so wrong. I could have, but I didn't.
Interesting. So you wanted to try to stay ahead of the draft and choose where you go rather than
be drafted
into the Marine Corps and send a case on or something.
And I have to add, I didn't have the courage or whatever you would call it to go to Canada. We are right on the Niagara River here, and I stood on that riverside more than once looking at Canada. It's like, I can't do it. I can't do it. What's wild is that the war, my war, quote unquote, the war that I was part of was the 1973 war between Israel and it was exactly what's going on right now.
Right, in Palestine.
And in fact, this version of this war started 50 years to the day that the one in 73 did. So, and that's the one that I was part of, so that was my deal, and going through that whole thing, and then, Franco died while I was in Spain, and that was a dictatorship that was decades long. And, the country was in some real serious shit. It was so not the United States of America. And I was living off base, right? The minute that I could move off base, I did, so I was living on the economy, as they say, and so it was just wild to be part of that whole thing, to have the Guardia Civil walking around with submachine guns on their backs, and all that kind of stuff, like the country going through that kind of turmoil, the Middle East flaring up the way that it did. There was a lot going on.
I think people often forget that there are so many other wars and shadow wars and small conflicts that we are engaged in the United States. I can identify a little bit, like when we were in the Persian Gulf and fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, our master at arms at the time had left our command and he got moved to Africa. And we had no idea that there was all these little shadow wars happening in Africa. And this was 2005. And since then, a lot more has come out about that and like training grounds for terrorism and things like that. But, you know, you're describing your experience in the Spanish dictatorship and during that era and the Israeli-Palestine conflict of that decade. Meanwhile, Vietnam is going on.
Yep.
Right. And that's still kind of reaching its tail end, but it's still happening.
Yep.
And that's really, that's fascinating. I don't think a lot of people ever really think about the magnitude of how far our reach kind of goes throughout the world.
Right.
I'm going to go back to, we had a phone conversation like a couple of weeks ago, and you had an initial apprehension to come on and talk, and it was mostly because you didn't feel like you were in combat and you didn't want to kind of contribute to that kind of conversation and stuff like that. But for me, that's important to get out there, because the number of veterans that are committing suicide does not reflect the number of veterans who have been in combat.
In combat, yeah.
So that there is something huge and important about that detail. And the other thing is I have some combat veteran buddies they'll talk shit about other vets, you know, who are experiencing difficulty and trauma and stuff like that, who weren't in combat zones, and they get really upset about it. And part of me understands why they're upset. But at the same time, you can't really minimize somebody's experience in that way. And especially if they volunteered to serve their country.
Right.
I mean, the service, the sacrifice it takes to be away from your family, and to just the balls, honestly, it takes the courage to get up, and that's a great unknown.
Yeah.
There's a lot of information you think you can get before you go to basic training, but the truth is you do not know what it is like inside of that world. Now, that's not to say that there are people getting benefits that were in basic training for a week and a half and got out and claimed some kind of PTSD. That's a different thing. Right. That's a character flaw in a human being.
Right.
But those aren't the people that are killing themselves, right? It goes much more beyond that. And after our conversation, you kept feeding me all these really fascinating articles. And one of them being the EMDR therapy, which I have done personally, and that was a game changer. But you sent me an article about CPTSD that was really, really eye-opening.
Yeah.
Because I had experienced, I didn't realize this, but upon many decades of therapy and friendships and failed marriages and stuff, I realized that, oh, wow, I had a bucket load of trauma before I even joined the military.
Right.
Like that's a thing. And I don't think we often talk about that.
And I think that is a piece of this that rarely gets talked about or doesn't get talked about enough, is the fact that, you know, there is the obvious trauma of being in combat, you know, or being in, you know, under the threat of combat, living under the threat of combat, you know, or going through it, that causes trauma. You know, but as you say, there's a lot of service people who are committing suicide that were not part of that kind of thing. You know, that they're still. And so in my mind, and just to make one clarification on my background, my last 20 years was with it's called the John R. O'Shea Foundation. And so we were providing funding to various programs, in mental health and education, arts, everything. You know, I mean, we had a full range of things that we provided funding for. And that's where a lot of this came up for me, you know, where I was learning a lot because I was receiving grants from people who wanted to, let's try this, let's do this. You know, and so I needed to understand, you know, and in my own personal situation, you know, I had already been, you know, through a lot of stuff that I needed to have help with, you know, I mean, up before I got to the philanthropy. So I was very sensitive to the whole idea, you know, and then having been in the military and understanding, not only that life, but another country. You know, I mean, I was in another country for 3 years where I just completely was disconnected except for like a few weeks home every year, something like that. But coming back was more traumatic for me, and trying to readjust and understanding, from the perspective of a country that has nothing and is a dictatorship, what we have here and the level of waste and the level of just, obliviousness about the rest of the world that this country has, that was really hard to accept. It really was hard. Going into the military with a lot of baggage already, right? I mean, that's what a lot of, as we talked about just briefly earlier, that most of the people who are getting drafted or who are volunteering are people who come from difficult circumstances, people who came up in poverty, people who came up in broken families, that they were looking for someplace to go, they needed someplace to go, and it wasn't college, because they didn't have the money or the whatever, and it wasn't, to a job because they weren't ready for that, et cetera. So you have people who are already in some ways broken, that are going into a system that is going to hammer them into what they want, and then once they're hammered, they're supposed to hold on to that until they need it to be released in battle or combat or whatever it is. So you've got people who are just compressed and ready to go, whether they got to go or not. And so all of a sudden it's just like becomes overwhelming, and I think that, to me personally, I believe that is what explains, or what should be looked at more, that the pre-existing trauma that people enter the service with, combined with the trauma that the service imposes, right? Even if you're not in combat, that's a pretty traumatic experience getting off that bus, and
it can be for sure.
And having no real way to say, I'm broken, I need help. It's like we talked a little bit about first responders, how they cannot, under any circumstance, open their mouth about feeling.
Oh, they'll take their gun, their badge,
the gun, the badge, everything goes. So the minute that you go there, and so you hold it until you can't hold it anymore. And I think that, there's obviously suicide rates among first responders is equally as high as military, and so, I think so the CPTSD, the C is complex, right? PTSD, meaning that it has existed from birth. That this is something that has many different aspects to having come. PTSD for a lot of people is a single instant, right? Something happened, right? The other article I sent to you, the woman had been carjacked,
right?
And then she, she was suffering from PTSD. That's the way most people think about PTSD, that something happened. They don't think about the fact that a bunch of things have happened to people through childhood, that, the way that they had to live, coming up as children, and the parents, what the parents had available to them to be able to provide to the children is less. And, that all of that, the first time that somebody said that children in poverty areas were suffering from PTSD, to me, I was just blown completely away. It never had occurred to me, that could be, how can that be true? That nothing happened to them, right? And so then, but as you start unpeeling this and looking at it, it's like, okay, all of these things are happening to these humans who have no way of processing it and accommodating or doing something with it, who are then put into, as they grow up, more and more difficult positions, and still not being able to resolve, all of the things that they have had happen to them. 10 years ago or so, trauma-informed care became something, that there's a recognition that that kind of stuff was going on. And that, no matter what was going on, if you brought a kid to a hospital, for example, you could traumatize that kid without even understanding. You re-traumatize, that you're going to trigger the trauma by stuffing him into a room, wait here, close the door. It's like, oh my God, and the kid freaks out, or whatever happens. There are a million ways of triggering people, and obviously there's no way of knowing that somebody has been through trauma, but there are ways of adjusting the system to receive people, so that the potential triggers are minimized. Understanding that many people have been through trauma and it's probably been complex, and has been ongoing. And therefore, what's the saying is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you.
Right.
So it's a different way of looking at it.
Right. And PTSD is a normal thing. It's the body's normal response to a traumatic event. Like, there is a push for a lot of people to even remove the D because it's not a disorder, right?
Right.
But when you start talking about CPTSD, I think that makes more sense as a disorder because there's a lot of layers of that onion to really peel back. And from my own personal experience, I kind of grew up in poverty and this and that, had, issues at home and stuff like that. But when I would join the Navy and I got off that bus, I actually connected and felt like, oh, this is a good place for me. Like, I need this structure. And that structure was so important for me. I finished my enlistment in 2006. So that's a long time ago.
Right.
I just felt like that was going to fix me. And for a while it did. And going back to what you said earlier about retransitioning back into civilian lifestyle, like, I didn't re-enlist, even though they were, throwing $50,000, $60,000 tax-free in 2005, 2006 to stay in the war effort.
Yep.
I was like, well, I really feel like you guys fixed me. I feel the best I've ever been, right? I have a good, solid structure of who I am. I know how to work in teams really well. And I thought that was going to follow me out into the civilian world. And it was the furthest thing from the truth.
Right.
Like, absolutely. When I got out, it was such a feeling of loss. And like, I would go work these jobs and the people you're working with don't have a minimum baseline standard.
Right.
And that's what was for me beneficial in the service. So there's also a thing. Sometimes people that serve 20, 25 years, they don't realize what they're walking out into. And that's another detrimental issue. Is I felt like that after 4 years that the military structure fixed me and healed me and made me good to go. And I can go out in the world and conquer anything. Right. And that was just not the case. Like, I couldn't pay my phone bill, or I didn't know how to mail letters. Right. Because if you're listening and you're not experienced with the military, there is a job for every single thing in the military. And, you're really catered to hand and foot to be able to just focus solely on your job, being a radio man, working on aircraft, right? Whatever it is your job is, you don't necessarily have to worry about paying your rent and your bills. Like, if you're living on the base and following that structure closely, you don't really know you don't have to be a productive person in those regards. They want you to focus solely on your job. And those little soft skills are actually what makes or break people a lot of times in the world. And that's just my experience. But when you brought out getting out of the military and having that be its own kind of trauma, that really hit hard with me. Because it really.
Yeah. So my experience was a little bit different because I had enormous issues with my father, when I was coming up. And so probably the worst place for me to be was in an authoritarian structure, because I had problems with authority.
Sure.
Yeah. And so of course, being the way that I am, I couldn't give it up. So I banged my head the whole time. I resisted. It was stupid. It was just a stupid thing to do. Eventually I sort of calmed down but I kept growing my hair, just long enough to piss him off, just stupid stuff like that, but it was always, I'm not
You can't let them take everything from you.
You're not going to get me. You know what I mean? It's like, and so anyway, so I did that for 3.5 years. It didn't fix me in the way that you're talking. I understand exactly what you mean. The whole structure thing. There is a relief to knowing exactly what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it, how you're supposed to do it, and how you're supposed to look as you do it, and so, but for me, it was just something that I could never relax into.
So what was it like exiting the military during that time? Because you see a lot of things like Rambo First Blood is a good example, right? Like that's a very heightened, super dramatized version of this, where he gets out of fighting in Vietnam and just wants to be left alone. He's in charge of $1 million worth of equipment. But what was your experience? We'll dive into that a little bit more about like how you were received back home, like when you came back, because you weren't in Vietnam. Like I don't imagine somebody called you a baby killer, right? Like,
well, no, but people, there was no way of identifying who was in Vietnam and who wasn't. It's just if you're military, you're fucking bad. You're shit. Combat vets I can try to imagine. I know of known, guys who, but they came back and it's like, how can you do that? How can you even think? How can you say this to these guys, to these people? It was so fucking wrong, and where's Nixon and everybody else backing up the military saying, oh no, we can't say this about our men, and here's, the Veterans Administration. Oh no, we're going to give you all the help you need. It's like, get the fuck out of here. You're out, go ahead. Thanks for your help. Goodbye. And that just persisted for Vietnam vets, other vets coming back didn't get the same treatment. George Bush, on the deck of, mission accomplished, our heroes, the military, everybody. And so they came back heroes. Vietnam vets were not anything like heroes, and that added to the trauma of what was going on. In addition to coming back from just an apocalypse now experience for a lot of them, they were coming back out of this just bizarre experience and back into a country that didn't obviously understand what they had been through and why this was not their fault. How could this be my fault? I was told to do this. This was what I was doing to save you. And there was the speech that when Sylvester Stallone breaks down at the end of, and he has that, 5-minute long, just tirade, crying, just resonant thing, I think, for me, for a lot of vets. Yeah, Vietnam was bad, and other wars not so much, and it doesn't matter.
I didn't have that experience coming back because I'm the post 9/11 generation. Right. So I swore into the Navy 2 days before the Twin Towers were hit.
Oh my God.
So we weren't at war, right? I joined the delayed entry program because if I wanted to go to college, that was the only way to do it.
That was for me too, yep.
So when I got out in 2006, I pretty much came back as the first wave of veterans leaving the service after that war had all started. So there was still very much like championing of like, hey, great job. Thanks a lot for going to do that, especially in New York State. But I did not have that post-Vietnam experience at all. And that's great because I couldn't imagine that kind of trauma coming back and having to deal with people spitting on you.
And now it's like, thank you for your service. And when you talk about trauma and triggers, I could understand someone saying to a Vietnam vet, thank you for your service, being a trigger for, all of the trauma that they went through.
Especially drafted, right? Like they didn't even want to go.
They didn't want to go, right? They were trying to get out of it. They were trying to whatever, Anyway, But one thing, so I wanted to sort of transition for a second back to this whole idea of trauma being held in the body, right? And for a lot of people, I mean, a lot of people have, I mean, you've seen movies and there's a lot of stuff where, you know, there is a physical response to a traumatic environment or experience, you know, something that, you know, there's usually something, they usually try to make it clear, like, oh, there's a direct relationship between being carjacked and having, you know, hyperventilation, panic attacks, you know, I mean, and maybe there is. But there's more that happens in the body, you know, I mean, as you experience pain and anxiety and emotional incidents in your life, you know, I mean, different things start to happen in your body. You know, I mean, it's not just in your head, you know, and as trauma-informed care became more and more a part of counseling and how people are helped with trauma, the correlation between physical symptoms like heart disease, obesity, you know, there's a whole, whatever list you want to look at, you could lay the incidence of those diseases on top of a chart of people who had taken the trauma instrument that, you know, on a scale of 1 to 7, you know, how many traumatic things had happened. You could overlay those two things and it would be almost identical. You know, in other words,
that's fascinating.
It is fascinating and it's scary as hell.
Right.
You know, I mean, and I was once again, blown away when I was sitting in this auditorium watching, you know, this presentation. And so, you know, then I look at, you know, I mean, I've been much this way for a long time. And so, you know, if I wanted to look, and when I took the instrument for measuring, you know, like I think I was like a 5 or a 6 on the scale, you know what I mean? And it's like, okay, so, you know, if I was a therapist, you know, I would be saying to myself, oh my God, this guy's, so that's what's going on here. And so, you know, there's, you know, there are physical things that are going on with people that may or may not be about physical, issues. You know, they may be emotional or, you know, behavioral, mental issues that are parking themselves in the body. You know what I mean? Finding a place to be in the body. So this goes way back now to, I don't know, 60s, you know, where it was a massage type approach. It was called Rolfing, R-O-L-F-I-N-G, Rolfing. And what they would do with Rolfing is they would, as they massaged, they would go deep, you know, deep massage, etc. But they would find places where, you know, the person who was being massaged, would talk about what they were feeling when the massage therapist hit a certain place, right? And it got to, allegedly, you could go through this, you know, long period of massage therapy, that would release a lot of what was being held in the body, abuse or, whatever it was that you went through that was held in the body, would be released. What was the book that I showed you? What's held in the body?
How the body keeps score.
Yeah, how the body keeps score, whatever it is. Yeah. And that is what they're talking about. So that is, again, looking at, you know, trauma is not just emotional. It's also physical, you know, and people, you know, are trying to understand why they are the way they are physically. You know, why do I have the, you know, oh, well, it's genetic. You know, well, maybe it's genetic. You know, it might be genetic. There's a lot of things that my family has that I managed to avoid because, you know, I took a different path earlier in life, you know, and, you know, I mean, obviously some of it is stubborn, but a lot of it isn't. But the point again is, you know, I mean, trauma, and post-traumatic stress, complex post-traumatic stress, that the way that manifests is how it parks itself in the body, where it finds, an expression or whatever it is in the body, that is not being talked about. When I was doing philanthropy, so myself and another, one of the foundation executives had gone to Albany because she was doing, mental health and I was doing, physical health, primary care, whatever. And so we decided we were going to go to Albany and talk to the commissioner of mental health and talk to the commissioner of health and tell them that we were willing to put money on the table if they would allow, the mental health professionals to talk to the primary care professionals because that was illegal. You could not have the person's mental health folder in the same room as his or her, primary care folder.
Is it still that way?
No, it's changed.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds asinine.
But I mean, it was, but that's the point, that the division of care of the mind from the body, right, has been, consistent throughout Western medicine, right, up until more recently. And that's again, where you're starting to think, or you're starting to find, what's going on, so you can now we're trying to bring the whole person together, and treat the whole person, as opposed to, okay, here's your mental problems, here's your physical problems, and there's the person you see from there's and if they're not talking to each other, nothing happens. Nothing changes.
Yeah. And that does, just from a logical standpoint, you think that like when you're experiencing stress or trauma, your blood pressure goes up, you have different levels of adrenaline in your body, your muscles are tenser. Like it's all physical manifestations of emotional state. It's super fascinating. I'd like to change gears.
Sure.
And talk more about your creative life and kind of where that fits into all of this, if it fits in at all. Because I've read a number of your poems, and to me, it seems like that was a very cathartic way to examine a lot of things in your life.
Yeah, there's a direct connection there. So this goes back, I remember the first thing I ever wrote, just been through it with my father. I was probably, 10, 12, something along those lines, and I had gone down to my bedroom and I just wrote out this thing about how much I hated him and, all this kind of stuff. And that was the only way that I could express, what was happening to me inside, after having just gone through it with him. And so, that continued. In other words, we started, there's a couple of my friends, we did the garage band thing. Mm-hmm. And then I was the lyricist, of course, and so this was right after Tommy came out. And so, of course,
Who, yes.
Yeah, so I had to write a rock opera, and so I did that. And we were putting music to our rock opera because that's what, people, and we were like, we're never going to play a cover ever. It was like, that was, the era of no covers, man. We only do original stuff, and none of us knew what the hell we were doing, but, so, and the way that I would write, I would listen to Bob Dylan songs and copy his rhythm and rhyme schemes, mm-hmm. and then just substitute my own words, more or less. That's the way that I would write a lot of my stuff, or whatever other song. But Dylan really was he was the man for me, he was the one that got it going. And from when I was 14 or so until I was like 17, and then I was in the Navy, that I couldn't sign until I was 18. And I was like, no, I want now. You got to. Mm-hmm. And so he had to go down to the office with the recruiting office and sign the contract. Yeah, you can have him. It's like, thank you. Thanks, Dad. One of the things about the service is you get people that from everywhere, that are just amazing. So I lived with, 4 or 5 guys. There's this one of my room, JD Church was his name. but he was 19, 18. He would rip Duane Allman solos, I mean, all fucking day long. He was just amazing, and so we played the Allman Brothers, and we played all, and again, we didn't play out anywhere. It was just, that's how we were expressing, and so it was just a thing in itself. It wasn't for the purpose of going out and forming a band and we're going to go out and play or any of that stuff. It's just to play, and that to me was an enormous relief just to be able to do that. And as you said, you were talking about, playing with yourself, or, playing to Pandora, you know what I mean, is different from playing in a group. That camaraderie, the ability to work with other people, etc. But there's nothing wrong with playing by myself with Pandora. Yeah. I have a great time. You know what I mean? And so, that is a way of expressing the writing. It stayed in there. And then, it was sort of there through the Navy. And then when I graduated, I had to go back and work for my parents for a while in their business. And then I was, gonna try to do a business degree of some sort. I was like, I don't want to do this. You know what I mean? So I ended up signing up for some English stuff. And then, I came across a couple of really great, poets. It was just a blast. I just started having a lot of fun doing that. Then that's when I started on the path with writing, with the writing community, poetry mainly. I was doing a reading series at the Central Park Grill, with Nancy Parisi, and we did that. I did the WBFO thing. I mean, just being really engaged with that writing, the creative community, but that is also musicians, artists, everybody is all together in that.
Right.
And Buffalo is just the most astounding place, for these networks of creative people.
It's one of the best in the country.
It is just, it's amazing. Mm-hmm. It's just amazing. So one of the places where I was doing a lot of my work is women's studies. So it was, there was a lot of women that I knew I was more drawn to their ability to be emotional, right? Than men's ability to be,
vulnerable. Vulnerable.
Well, vulnerable, but they were building. This was expression. This was,
I see. Gotcha.
Like that, they built the poem here, One of the things that I've been fighting forever, in the creative stuff is that in that period of time, the men in the upper academy, would never, saying I, me, I, was, the cardinal sin, because, you don't talk about yourself. You talk about what you see in the world, but you don't say I, because that's subjective, mm-hmm. right? And the point of poetry is to be objective, and you have to pretend that you're not there. And I could never, I got so tangled in that, I'm still now, I still, when I write it's like, oh, I better not do that, but it's just a really weird thing, but it's like, it is me, I can't not say that this is not me. Everybody is subjective. I don't care how objective you think you're being, mm-hmm. You are subjectively looking, you're choosing things that are, yes, objectively, I see those things on the wall over there, but somebody else might not have noticed them. That means that I'm being subjective. The writing, became critical to, my mental health through the post-Navy period, through, what I was in English for, I think, was therapy. I was originally, I did a minor in my minor was in psychology because I was looking for what the hell, which is what most people I think are doing.
Right. That's how you enter that field. Why am I so fucked up?
Yeah, exactly. And then I get into English, and then as I got higher in English, up to I was I finished my master's, and I was offered the David Gray Fellowship in Poetry and Letters. That would be to finish a PhD. I didn't have to teach. They would pay me a stipend. And it would just be to, and at that level, at the PhD level of just about anything I've ever seen, it becomes so small, and so petty in some ways. If you're not doing it this way, you're wrong. And there's this big competition about who's right, and how are you gonna, and it's like, you know what, man, fuck
it's such
this.
A creative turnoff.
Fuck this. And I was in the last class that was allowed to do a creative writing project as a master's thesis. They then disbanded or ended the creative writing masters at UB right as I was finishing. Because they wanted all secondary sources. They wanted research. They wanted, it has to be because UB was becoming a global university.
Right.
They were being research oriented. They were going to, et cetera. And that mess didn't fit in there. The emotional mess of English and theater and arts and all of that.
Truth,
whatever.
Yeah.
Didn't fit in with the nice, clean, here's the research, here's what we're doing in blood. It just became a soulless place. And as I just said, here's your fellowship. Thanks a lot. I'm out. And that's when I started working for nonprofits. And writing stayed, and published the first book in 2008. And the second was 11. And then, some, digital stuff, around that. But to say that, there are a lot of people who will say, I'm not creative. I can't do this. This can't be part of my recovery, part of my therapy, because I'm just not creative. And I would say that, A, that's not true. And B, you don't have to be creative, in the sense of presenting it to someone. Right. Like I said, I have a blast playing, along with Pandora in the headphones. It doesn't matter how good or bad I am. It's just something that I'm doing for myself.
Yeah. I believe this too. It's something I always push, is that you don't have to be good at something to find joy in it.
Right.
And especially in the age of YouTube, when there's a million guitar shredders out there and stuff like that, like it can really scare people away from doing that kind of stuff.
For sure.
It's nonsense. And then I get a lot that people are like, oh, I wish I had musical ability. If you're saying this to me, you have speaking is the most fundamental, basic musical act every one of us that can speak does. There's call and response, there's give and take, there's dynamics, there's all this kind of thing, all these musical elements. Speech is the most musical thing that people have access to. And you can easily turn that into writing or things like that. And real quick, you guys, the Oshai Foundation, when you were still there, funded the Odyssey Project, Brendan Bannon's project, which got cameras in the hands of veterans. And that was critical for me, but also some of the other people. I had Steve Schultz on the podcast, and he talked about how using the camera, he doesn't have to talk to you about his experiences or trauma. He doesn't have to verbalize it. He doesn't have to even go to that place with another person or a viewer. He just makes the image and he's able to share it. And then that's how he's able to communicate the things that he's going through or experience. So yeah, it's important to know that you can just throw on headphones and learn guitar.
You don't have to show it to anybody. You don't have to worry about, whether it's good, bad.
Right.
It's just the only thing that's important is whether you're feeling something as you're doing it, and like if I can nail a song that I'm listening to on Pandora, that feels really good. and that's what I need. I just need to have that good feeling, and I don't have to tell anybody about it. Nobody has heard it. Doesn't matter. It's just for me. If I get a good short poem that when I read it, it gives me a bit of a chill, that's fine. That's great. And
that's what art really is. Like I love this country. It's incredible. It's given me everything I have,
yep.
But the economic structure is a capitalist structure.
Yep.
And a lot of that dictates like the way arts and music and culture kind of gets driven forward. And they really do not naturally coexist together. These two things, capitalism and art making. Now we have to find a way to kind of coalesce and do that, but they don't belong together. So you don't have to be Pablo Picasso or Bob Dylan, right? You don't have to be those people to get the joy out of them. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Because that's important to me, and it's important for this podcast. Is a lot of what I'm talking about is that, it's for you. Like the creative expression is for you ultimately. So Paul, thanks a lot for coming in.
Yep.
This has been a great chat. You're listening to the Birds in the Sky podcast. I am your host, Matthew Crane, and stick around. We got more coming. You've been listening to Birds in the Sky. I am your host, Matthew Crane. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.